it's such an honor to moderate this panel of esteemed women. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. If you haven't read these books yet, you're in for a real treat because they are all outstanding page-turners with deeply complex characters. So I'm so excited to introduce everyone, and then we'll start off with our questions. So I'm going to start from farthest to closest to me. Gerry Wilson is the author of the literary historical novel, That Pinson Girl, and a short story collection, Cross Currents and Other Stories. Cross Currents was runner-up for the Press 53 Award for Short Fiction and a nominee for the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Fiction Award. A seventh-generation Mississippian, Gerry grew up in the red clay hills of the North that she writes about in That Pinson Girl and came of age during the turbulent civil rights era. She draws heavily on her Mississippi roots in most of her fiction. Gerry now lives here in Jackson. Next, we have Jamie Quatro. She's the author of Two-Step Devil. She's also the New York Times notable author of I Want to Show You More, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, and Fire Sermon, a book of the year for The Economist, San Francisco Chronicle, LitHub, Bloomberg, and the Times Literary Supplement. Jamie's fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The New York Review of Books, and Plowshares. She is the recipient of fellowships from McDowell and Gatto and teaches in the Sewanee School of Letters MFA program. Quatro lives with her family in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In addition to her latest novel, Beautiful Dreamers, Minrose Gwin is the author of the novels The Queen of Palmyra, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers pick, Promise, which was shortlisted for the Willie Morris Award in Southern Literature, and The Accidentals, which received the 2020 Mississippi Institute for Arts and Letters Award in Fiction. She has also published a memoir, Wishing for Snow. Minrose is a native of Mississippi. She began her writing career as a journalist and later taught at universities across the country, most recently the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And finally, to my right, we have Annaïse Heglar. She's the author of the novel Troubled Waters, as well as the children's book The World is Ours to Cherish. She is known for her essays that dissect and interrogate the climate crisis, drawing heavily on her personal experience as a Black woman with deep roots in the South. In 2020, she was selected as the inaugural writer-in-residence at Columbia University's Earth Institute and has gone on to teach at Columbia University in New York and Tulane University in New Orleans. She's based in New Orleans, but her heart is in Mississippi and her soul is in Birmingham. Let's give it up for these wonderful panelists.
I love that. I love that. Heart in Mississippi and soul in Birmingham.
So I have kind of a tailored question for each of you, and then some more general discussion questions that you can all answer as a group, and then we'll leave some time at the end for audience questions. I'm sure y'all have some great questions as well. So Jamie, and maybe before you answer the question too, if you can give a brief synopsis of your book for those who haven't read it yet. The prophet, who is one of the protagonists of Two-Step Devil, maybe one of the most memorable protagonists I've ever encountered. Can you describe him for us and where the inspiration for this character came from?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for showing up, and this is such a great crowd. It's so heartening. This book just came out Tuesday, so this is kind of my first thing. So thank you all. I'm not very practiced with my answers yet. You can give me notes after. First of all, I just have to say this cover. It's a trick cover, so if you cover half, it's an innocent lamb, and then if you slide your hand over this way, it's an evil goat. So, and why I bring that up is because that does give me an entree into talking about what the book's about briefly. It is about a man known as the Prophet. His name's Winston. He lives off the grid in Lookout Mountain, Alabama, and he is an outsider artist, which now my daughter, who just got her MA in art history, says, "Mom, that's no longer the correct term. It is now nonconformist art or self-taught art." So there, a PSA for you. But he is scrounging for materials one day in the local junkyard when he happens to see a Mercedes pull up to an abandoned gas station. Two shady figures get out and take a girl out of the back seat, teenage girl. She has zip ties on her wrists. He realizes two things. She's being trafficked, and he is supposed to rescue her. He believes she is his big fish that he's been waiting for to take his visions to the White House. And what follows is this dramatic rescue and then a kind of tender grandfather-granddaughter story almost, relationship between these two marginalized figures, voiceless figures. And then plot happens, and I won't give any spoilers. But the inspiration for the prophet is actually a man I know. I was raised my children on Lookout Mountain in Georgia, and was teaching my oldest to drive. She's 15. Terrible place to teach your daughter to drive on a mountain, windy up and down. So we went out the back of the mountain, where the roads are straight, so she could get up some speed. We got lost, happened upon a shack with pumpkins laid out for sale. A man came out and just said, "Would you like to see my art?" And my daughter's like, "Get back in the car." I'm like, "Let's leave." And I'm like, "Yes, I'm coming inside to see her art." She's like, got her phone. And I went in there. I mean, it turned into a 15-year friendship, and the book is dedicated to him. His name's Ralph, and he's a brilliant, brilliant artist, and has some interesting ideas about the visionary and about politics and all of these. So I took notes and did research, and that was the genesis. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Gerry, well, if you can give us a brief, synopsis of that Pinson girl, and then I'll ask you your question.
Yeah, I will do that. Let me get this. Can you hear me? No?
A little closer.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. My book is That Pinson Girl. It is set during World War I in northeast Mississippi in the Red Clay Hills, where I grew up. So that's probably my most familiar place in the whole world, even though I haven't lived there in such a long time. But it takes place around the time of the war and also the influenza epidemic. And the girl, are you sure it's on? Are you sure it's on?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Okay. The girl, that Pinson girl, is Leona. Leona Pinson is about 17 years old when the book opens. And she is giving birth to a child whose father she refuses to name, which in this very rural place back in that time, just automatically rendered her an outcast, more or less. Scorned by the community, scorned by her family. So it's Leona's story and how she copes with that outsider status. The young man, who's the father of the child, has gone off to France without knowing about the baby. I won't say what happens to him exactly because it's such an important turn in the story. But the relationships are complicated, to say the least. Her mother is very distant. They have an aunt living with them, Sally Pinson, who is a little person. So she is also an outsider, an other. Leona's brother is very cruel and troubled, and he is really at odds with himself and his father for many reasons. For one thing, he resents the fact that he was not allowed to go to war. That would have made him as a man. And because he is the sole male breadwinner on the farm, they won't let him even enlist. And so he's very bitter about that. And he rides with some night riders, raiders, the kinds of ruthless groups of men who were riding the countryside around that time in the aftermath, well after the Civil War. There's a kind of resurgence of that kind of Ku Klux Klan type cruelty. So, and I have to mention too, there's Luther Biggs, who is a biracial sharecropper, has really close and complicated ties with the Pinson family. But Luther is the closest thing to a father that Leona has. Her own father has died a couple of years before the book opens of a hunting accident, and I'll put that in air quotes because some people don't believe that it was really an accident. So those are kind of the basics, and I will comment on the cover too, which I love, but it might be a little misleading because this is not a rosy story. Maybe the thorns, the prominent thorns on the stems of the roses are a better indication of the sort of dark side to this story, but redeemable, maybe.
So, Gerry, thank you for that synopsis. I have a question because most of the book is from Leona's point of view, but there are chapters written from most of the main characters in the book, even the villain, Raymond, which helps, kind of make the characters feel complex. What was it like to move this story forward from multiple points of view?
Well, I tried writing it all from Leona's point of view, and I played around with it some in terms of point of view. And I just discovered, and I admire anybody who can do a first-person narration from page 1 all the way through. It seemed to me that I could open up insights to Leona through these other characters and the way that they saw her, the way that they perceived this kind of narrow world that they were living in. So that was an aspect of it that I kind of enjoyed. It was kind of fun to do that.
Yeah, actually, we have a few, I think 3 of these books come from multiple points of view, so that's really interesting. Mary, in the After the Word of your book, I like that it's called the After the Word, you write, I needed to talk about, oh wait, actually, you know what? Before I launch into your question, can you please give us a synopsis of your book for those who might not have read it?
Sure.
And then we'll launch into the question.
Absolutely. So the most succinct way that I can describe the story of Troubled Waters, lovely, is that it is a conversation between the climate change generation and the civil rights generation. The longer way to describe that is my main character, Corinne, is 20 years old in the summer of 2014. She has always been kind of an environmentalist. After she goes away to college, becomes a little bit more involved in it. She majors in environmental studies, starts engaging in environmental activism at her college. But in 2013, her brother dies while working on an oil boat. And that sinks her into this incredible phase of grief, where she is grieving both the planet that she stands on and her brother. And that wakes her up not just to environmentalism, not just to climate change, but to the people who are actually responsible for it, so the oil industry. And so she becomes really frustrated with the types of environmentalism that she'd been exposed to before, this like save the polar bears, hug a tree, and decides that she wants to do something more direct, something more, she wants to confront the oil industry, and so she wants to do something a little bit riskier. And in so doing, she kind of peels back all these wounds in her family. Like I think on the cover we say like wakes up ghosts, but it's really more just like opening trauma for her family, because she knows that her grandmother integrated the schools in Nashville, Tennessee in 1957, but she doesn't know much of the details of that. And so when her grandmother finds out that she wants to do this, it just like unearths all of this horrible, horrible trauma for them. And they get to this point where it's like, are we gonna heal? And so they have a decision to make as a family.
Well, that was a wonderful synopsis. Thank you. Now I'll ask you the question. So in the After the Word of your book, you write, I needed to talk about the conversations that you are simply unqualified to have with your parents and grandparents when they are older than integration. How can I fuss at my grandfather about plastic in the ocean when he's seen lynch mobs? It's beautiful, the rest of that, but can you talk about your decision to craft this novel as a conversation between the young, and some might argue in her family, naive, millennial climate activist, and her grandmother, who's scarred by this experience of integrating Nashville's white public schools?
Yeah, so, I mean, the elephant in the room is that this school integration story is a true family story for me. My aunt integrated the schools in Nashville in 1957. And as a lot of people don't know, including myself, before I started doing the research, that's the first elementary school to integrate under Brown versus Board of Education. People often think it was New Orleans. It was not. New Orleans was like 1964. This was 1957. And so it was a story that like I kind of heard little bits and pieces of as a child. It was like kind of breadcrumbed, right? So like I remember, I think the first time I heard about it was I found a picture of Aunt Jackie in a photo album and I didn't recognize her, which is weird because I look exactly like her. And so I took the picture to my mom. I was like, who is this? And she was like, that's Aunt Jackie. That's when she was integrating the schools and they would try to make her look as bad as possible. I'm sorry, what? I have follow-up questions, right? Whoa, back that up, right? And she was like, nah, I'm making dinner now, gone somewhere, right? And so you know, after that, there were several different points where it would like come out, but it always kind of come out like a slap. And when I tried to ask more questions about it, I didn't, you know, I'm like 8. I don't really understand what trauma is or how it works. I definitely don't know how to recognize it. I just think somebody's being withholding, and I think it's like, you know, children are meant to be seen and not heard, so let me go and play outside or something. And so, but it was always just like this curiosity. And so when I started writing climate essays around 2018, I was always kind of trying to dispel some sort of myth in the way that we talked about climate change. Sometimes it was around, you know, people didn't even recognize what climate grief was so much at the time, that like the way that we react to what is happening to our planet is a type of grief. So I was writing about that. I was writing about, you know, these problems with putting the weight of climate change onto individuals' shoulders. But one of the things I really grappled with was that this assumption that climate change was the fault of previous generations, because they would say this is our grandparents' and our parents' fault. Not mine, and actually not a lot of people's, honestly, if we really look at the power structures of this country, right? But definitely not my grandfather, and I found that I took that personally when people would say it's my grandparents' generation's fault. And so when I kept trying to like dispel that myth in nonfiction, and it wasn't sticking. It was like, this is a story I need to show, not a story that I can tell. And so I started dreaming up this novel, and I knew I wanted to explore the school integration story and learn more about it. And I'm so glad that I did, because it was like finding different you know, layers of myself and my family in it. So
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. All right, Minrose, will you give us a synopsis of Beautiful Dreamers, and then I will ask you a question.
Okay. First of all, thank you for coming. This is great. I'm just looking back and thinking of all the people who are interested in Southern fiction, and it's just terrific to see this. I'll start out by saying that this is my book, and the character of Memory Feather, she is narrating the story of about a period of about 5 or 6 years in her life, and she's looking back on it as a wildlife biologist, and particularly interested in wading birds. And she is looking back on her life. And what happened was that her father absconded with the person that her mother called the frog hussy. And the frog hussy was a French woman, and her father was a translator for the army. And so during the Cold War, and he absconded with this French woman. I won't repeat the frog hussy again, but I guess I just did. And and leaving them really, her and her mother, Virginia Feather, high and dry, literally, at 5,000 feet in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so the mother goes to work in a very shabby and questionable motel in Albuquerque as a housekeeper. And so they live in the motel, and then the grandparents in a place called Belcote, I made up the name, but it's really Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, find out what's going on, and they send word that if Virginia, the mother, doesn't come back with Memory, the daughter, to Belcote, they will file suit to get custody of her. So they go back. They stay with the grandparents, I think a total of 2 days, until Virginia has a falling out with them. And Virginia then moves her and herself and Memory into her best friend's home. And her best friend is Mac McFadden, who is a gay man who is also a physicist and a gallery owner in Belcote. So the story happens in the 1950s and early 1960s. And so this is a very unusual arrangement between the three of them. But Memory and Mac find a kind of loving relationship during this period. And they live, even though there's homophobia and Mac gets beaten up, there's also Mac works, although he is white, he is a Southerner, he works in the civil rights movement. And this puts him at great risk himself. So, but they make up this loving family within all of these outside social pressures. And they do it very successfully until this con man, a very, very beautiful man, a charismatic man, comes into their lives and basically ends up, I'm not going to tell the story, but he ends up causing terrible havoc and tragedy in the family.
Yeah, and if anyone has ever met a narcissist, they will recognize that man.
Yeah, yes, he lies.
So Minrose, Memory Feather is it's told in first person from Memory's point of view. And I love first-person narrators because there's a lot of similarity to memoir, just in the distortion of memory. There's a lot of raw vulnerability too. And so I'm wondering, why did you decide on telling this story through Memory's eyes, through her memory?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think everybody sitting up here at this table, and many of you also, it's very interesting how point of view in fiction happens. And, it's kind of a mystery, I think. I've always started out a book. I've written from various points of view in my novels, and I've always started out a book in whatever way I thought would work. And once with one of my novels, a writer friend who read it said, maybe you should cast this in the third person. And this was my novel, The Accidentals, which is told in 7 first-person narratives. She said, maybe you should, just get to one, And it never worked for me. And I think it's kind of a mystery for myself how that happens when, you don't just say, I'm going to choose this point of view. You just kind of start writing in whatever sounds right to you, whatever seems to work for you.
Well, we're in Jackson, Mississippi on the Southern Fiction panel, so I have to have a Eudora Welty quote thrown in here. Welty wrote that place absorbs our earliest notice and attention. It bestows on us our original awareness. And she has a lot to say about place in fiction, and I think all of you have so beautifully conjured up a place or maybe places in your work, in these novels. Can you talk about the importance of setting when you're thinking about crafting the story, and maybe talk a little bit about where your book takes place and how that is so pivotal to what happens? And maybe, Jamie, I learned you were from Arizona, or you grew up in Arizona last night, so yeah. And you have a Southern fiction book, so maybe you can kick off this discussion.
Yeah, this is my third book. With my first book, I remember feeling like, do I have the right to set my fiction in the South? It's just a storied history. There's, Papa Faulkner, and we've got Cormac McCarthy, and we've got Eudora Welty and St. Flannery, and all of these people who were such influences on me in my literary life. And then here I am setting a book in Lookout Mountain, and I went to Jill McCorkle, who was my advisor at Bennington, and said, Jill, I don't think I have a right to do this, and she gave me permission. So she was like, you have a right. You're raising your babies in the South. You get to right. It's true. I did raise 4 children, so 2 of them have accents. But I have an adopted Southerner, although we've lived here for 20 years now, so longer than I did live in Arizona. I was born in California and grew up in Tucson, a different South, in the Southwest. But I think, just to invoke Welty, to answer the question, Eudora Welty's parents were not Southerners. They were from the Midwest. So Eudora grew up going north. So I think it gave her eyes and ears to see a South that a lot of people who never left the South could see. And I feel that for myself, that when we moved to Lookout Mountain in 2005, I would say, there's hospital trenches from the Civil War, 200 yards from my house. And I would tell people, my neighbors, did you know this? And they're like, what are you talking about? I've lived here my whole life. There's no hospital trenches. And I think you just become inured. You become hardened, when you've lived in a place. And so there is something about being an outsider that has inflected and informed the way I approach my setting. Lookout Mountain's bifurcated into 2 states, 3 if you go all the way to Alabama, but there's Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama. And there's something interesting there. The Georgia side does not have leash laws. The Tennessee side does have leash laws. So when you're out running which side you're on, because dogs follow you on one side. And the other side, they have to be. So it's just little things like that, I think. And I've just, all 3 of my books have now been set in the South. Although the next one, I think, might be Arizona. So getting back to the hometown. Yeah.
I'll comment next. Because I didn't mention where my book is set. My book is set in Port Gibson, Mississippi, and Vicksburg, Mississippi. So these bridges on the cover, that is the Mississippi River at Vicksburg. There's a little bit of New Orleans, a little bit of Ohio in it as well. And place is incredibly important in this story. I mean, my main character is a Mississippi girl in the way that I'm not. Like, she was born here, her people are from here. I was born in Alabama, my people are from Alabama. And so for her, she falls in love with the Mississippi River in a way that I love the Mississippi, I admire the Mississippi River. She thinks it's a person. And so whenever she talks about the river, she talks about it like it's a family member. And one of the things I wanted to demonstrate with that is the inherent environmentalism in Southerners and in Mississippians. I think that we are very proud of our home state. We're proud of how beautiful it is. We're proud of the things that can grow from its soil. If you ever talk to a Mississippian on any part of the political spectrum, they will talk about how beautiful this place is, how sacred it is. And I think that is just an inherent, you don't need to go to school, you don't need to get no degree to be that type of environmentalist. And I think that's really important. And also, I think, this story brought me back home. I started writing it in the spring of 2019. I was still living in New York City. Honestly, I was real sick of New York by that point. I've been living there I lived there for a total of 15 years. And the only thing that kept me up there that long was that, this doesn't leave this room, but I couldn't drive. Okay, I had to learn how to drive to come back home, and so in the process of writing it, in the process of even reading back over it in my revisions, I see so much homesickness and so much yearning in this book. That was a very real part of where I was when I wrote it, and it was like the winter of 2021 where I was like, okay, that's it. We're packing it up. We're gonna sign up for driver's ed classes. We're going to learn how to drive in New York City. Do you know how frustrating that is to learn how to drive in New York and then come back to Mississippi and it's like, oh, ain't nobody out here. Nobody's out here, But I had to come home to finish writing it. I basically got to this point of extreme writer's block after I'd written the first version, and I had these revisions that I needed to make, and I just couldn't do it. And I came back south, and I was just here for a year, and then all of a sudden it clicked. And I cranked out the revisions in 2 weeks. But I needed to be back. I needed to hear that laughter. I needed to feel that humidity on my skin. I needed to drive on these roads as poorly as I drove at that time. But I needed to, not only was the place important to the story, it was important to me and to the process of writing it.
I can speak next. the reason that I set my book on the Mississippi Gulf Coast is that I've spent I'm from Northeast Mississippi, and as someone pointed out at the last event I did, that Northeast Mississippi and the Mississippi Gulf Coast are two really different countries, and and so. But I spent quite a bit of time actually in the process of writing my first novel down there, I've always been taken with the Mississippi Sound and the mystery of that area and the quietness of the ocean there, the Gulf, and this kind of 90-mile-long thumb of water there. And there's this sense of peace in that, that's very, and mystery. And I wanted the book to have a certain amount of mystery in it. And the reason I didn't set it in Bay St. Louis by name was I'd already started the research on Bay St. Louis. I'd lived there for not lived there, but stayed there in a friend's beautiful house that I copied in Beautiful Dreamers. And I stayed there for like the course of 2 summers writing my first novel, about 3 or 4 days a week. And then I went back to New Orleans, and I found it both peaceful but also mysterious. And then right after Katrina happened, I went down there, and it appeared that the Sound and the Gulf had come in. Did any of you go down there or afterward? I went down there the October afterward, and it looked like the ocean, the water had come in like a huge monstrous animal and taken a big bite out of the town. And I thought to myself, boy, this peaceful, mysterious, lovely thumb of water, really did a lot of damage here. And so the other thing is that I got really interested in the deep history back to the Paleo-Indian age. And that land extended, there was no Sound and no Gulf, and the land extended all the way to Mexico. And there were animals there that you just wouldn't believe, saber-toothed tigers and huge, I've forgotten what you call them, elephant-like creatures. Mammoths, yeah, and it was just remarkable, this deep history. So that also informed my book.
Thank you. Gerry, I know you're writing about your home soil.
I am writing about my home soil, which is also William Faulkner's soil. And most of you probably know that he called that part of the state my postage stamp of native soil. And so that might seem like the most natural place for me to set a story, but in some ways it may be the hardest place to set a story because it is such a complicated place. I do think, though, that place just shapes us. Place in a story shapes character. The characters in that Pinson girl are very much the product of their time and place and culture. And so it was a lot of fun to explore that for me. I have to say, too, that the place is all tied in with my family history. I think maybe Lauren mentioned that I'm a 7th-generation Mississippian, which sounds pretty unbelievable even to me, but it's true on one side of my family. And I'm kind of fascinated by how place drew certain people there, how my great-great-grandparents met the people that they married and became my great-great-grandparents, and ultimately, through the generations, it has shaped us. I also have to do a little bit of a shout out to my maternal grandmother, who was born in a little place that straddles Pontotoc and Chickasaw counties called Redland. And of course, it's not there anymore. There's an overgrown cemetery. I can't find where the graves of my great-grandparents are. But she grew up very poor, she's very much the model for the main character in this book. She only had an 8th grade education. She lived a really hard life. Her existence was just really tough for most of her life. And so the place where she was born rendered her the person that she was. It did not keep her from being smart and creative and industrious. She was very persistent. She was tough. But for me to recreate that place and to feel the place is almost like a character in the book for me. It's very much alive. The characters are responsive to the place and the weather in ways that, and of course this was a long time ago when they were more vulnerable. You know, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have cars, or at least Leona Pinson's family didn't because they were too poor. But I love that idea that character and place are so closely intertwined. I may not set everything in North Mississippi just simply because it's where I'm from. I do have another story that's set there. I have a novel draft that's not. But I think the same thing applies regardless of the literal place or the literal place of the book. It has to be an essential part of who these characters are. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot more questions, too many, but I'm sure there's folks in the audience, you guys have questions too. So does anyone want to raise their hand and then I can repeat the question into the mic? I see a hand right there, yes.
So I am a Southern writer. I write a lot. I personally love the idea of crutches in writing, like the things and themes that you just can't stop writing about. Do any of you have crutches in writing, and how do they intersect in your book?
So the question is about crutches in writing, themes and things that you can't stop writing about, and do they show up in your books in any way?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was turning to look at you.
Themes that just keep bubbling up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely.
Great question.
The resilience of women, whether it's 1865 or 1920 or 1950, in mid-50s for both of you. But the persistence, the resilience of women against great odds. And it just, in the face of loss, betrayal, happiness, whatever, that's something that just keeps bubbling up for me in almost everything I write. Survival. Yeah.
Mine is religion, Christianity. I didn't really realize how Southern I was growing up in Arizona until I got to the South because I was raised in a very kind of the Church of Christ. Has anyone ever heard of the Church of Christ? Everyone's nodding. In Arizona, that was a weird denomination, but that cognitive dissonance I grew up with reading, like, you know, sex is bad, dancing's bad, alcohol's bad, and then you read the Bible and it's like sex, dancing, alcohol. So I grew up with this, like, you know, God's metaphor for God's love for the people is marriage and consummation, the bride and the bridegroom. And yet you're told the rules are like, no, this is a bad thing. So I think my fiction has always wrestled with that tension between the sexual and the sacred in some capacity. My first two books were about affairs. So the first one's an emotional affair and the second was an actual physical affair. I pushed it really far. It's funny the questions I get to, like, what does your husband think about this book? And No one's going to ask me about that in this book. Like, which character are you? The devil, the sex trafficking victim, or the old man? I'm like, nope. Those are my three main characters. I wrote really outside my experience this time. But yeah, the religion, it's just, this book's full of it. I mean, the third act of this book is a stage play, a very brief stage play in which it's called Gospel. And the devil himself, Two-Step is his name. And whether or not he's real or a kind of a figment of the prophet's imagination is up to the reader. But he puts on a play revisioning the gospel narrative with himself as the rightful Christ figure. So you'll recognize all the major gospel events in that play inverted in some way. So yeah, I cannot get away. I keep saying I'm going to write about like 15th century silk trading in Greece or something, but it just comes back to God and sex. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, on another note, I think all of my work deals with the loss of the mother. I lost my own mother when I was in my 30s, and she was in her 50s, and I lost her to mental illness. And that's really what my memoir, Wishing for Snow, is about her mental illness and my complete inability, even though I tried as hard as I could at the time, given where I was in life and my age and everything. But I lost my mother to mental illness, and she became very, very ill, and so the loss of a mother. I looked at I was thinking about my work as a whole the other day for some reason, and I thought, boy, you've got a lost mother in every single one of your novels. And so that's really a recurring theme that I didn't even know I was, writing, but I was.
So literally everything I've ever written and published touches on climate change or is about climate change in some sort of way, and that includes a children's book. So that's a talent. But I still wouldn't quite see it as a crutch, more as like a muse or a calling, because writing about climate change is not easy at all. There's nothing about writing about climate change that makes my writing easier. But it's probably something I will continue to do in some sort of way. And I think that, I honestly would encourage almost any writer to write about it. If you're writing about this planet, you are writing about a climate changed planet. And so it should be part of the story.
Well, that was a good question. I'm going to steal that for future panels. Do we have any other audience questions? Any brave souls out there that want to raise their hand and either ask one or all authors a question? If not, yeah, go ahead.
That's a good question of Jamie. When I started reading Two-Step Devil, I almost immediately thought of the author William Gay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's all I needed to know.
Okay.
When you were talking earlier, when you gave your synopsis, he came back to mind because he was an artist. He very much, the prophet reminded me of William Gay, an author we lost way too soon.
I mean, that's such a high compliment. Thank you, William Gay. And I forgot to mention also the writer Barry Hannah, a Mississippi writer who was a big influence on me. And I bring them both up because I met William Gay right before he passed. It was wild. How many people have met William Gay in this room? Yeah, it's back there. So I was at Sewanee. Barry Hannah had just died. His son, Poe Hannah is a friend of mine, and Poe had brought me his father's gold-plated cigarette lighter, like light from the master on high. He was like, I think he would want you to have this. I had written a couple essays about him for the Oxford American. So I'm standing in this circle with Jill McCorkle and Christine Scott. I think Tom Franklin was there. And Poe gives me this lighter, and William Gay was standing there, and he looks at me, and he gets really close, and he's like, I'm William. Maybe he said Bill, I don't remember. He got really close. He's like, what do you write? And I said, stories. I'm like shaking. He goes, good. And then he walked away. And that was all he ever said to me. That was like my one encounter with William Gay. But I he gave me permission for that first book. I hadn't published anything yet. It was going to be a collection of short stories. And I thought, okay, right, William Gay, good. So, yeah, that was my first book. I have nothing else to say about your question or anything.
If there was any, if you knew him, or if there was any kind of connection with him.
Yeah, no, I mean,
There is.
teensy, yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't
But his
that what
work,
writing
it's,
is
yeah.
and stories are their connection.
Yeah, and so many unconscious, subconscious influences too. Any other questions that we want to ask our panelists? Okay. Oh, I see a hand. Beverly.
What other writers were influenced y'all? Southern writers, or were there any other writers that had an influence that you read maybe when you were young and you had maybe took some style tips from this one or that one, or plot elements, or the way they develop character?
Yeah, I'll start because this gives me a chance to compliment my high school English teachers, two of whom are in the room. I feel like right there, tiny with school, y'all. And I do have to give them a lot of credit because especially my English teachers were very indulgent with me when I was in high school. I was an avid reader. They would give me like reading lists like that ought to hold you, and exposed me to a lot of Toni Morrison, a lot of Nikki Giovanni, a lot of other Southern writers, and so that was a big influence on me as I write this, as I write anything today. And also James Baldwin was a huge influence, in particular, If Beale Street Could Talk, and the way that he showed the love between the different family members, even when they weren't good at showing it themselves. So one of the main things going on in Troubled Waters is that the grandmother and the granddaughter are going through this period where they love each other deeply, but they're very bad at it, and they're trying to learn how to do it all over again. They're trying to learn new love languages for each other. So that was a big influence. Of course, there's Jesmyn Ward. We read a lot of Eudora Welty, I feel like, at Piney Woods too. So just Southern writers and the way that we personify things, in particular, was a big part of influencing this story. And I'm going to think of a whole lot of other writers as soon as I stop talking. But yeah, there were a lot of influences.
I'd say that my greatest influence, and speaking of high school teachers, I had a high school teacher give us all senior projects, and my senior project she delivered to me was Eudora Welty, and the work that I was supposed to talk about to the class was Delta Wedding, and I read it and I went, ugh. I don't know. But then later in life, I read Eudora Welty's stories, which I adore, and The Optimist's Daughter. And, I just became enamored of Eudora Welty, and some of my best friends are Eudora Welty scholars. But I would say probably, along with Welty, my two most... I taught literature for like 35 years, so I have so many favorites, but Wagner is right there. Absalom is like the most brilliant book that I've ever read, and along with Beloved by Toni Morrison. And Morrison, I've taught courses in Morrison, and I love every single novel that she's ever written, and all of those have influenced me, along with many, many, many other contemporary writers.
Well, Gerry, you were a high school English teacher. Shout out to high school English teachers.
Yeah, I was, and there's one right back there. Oh, there's more than one.
I bet there are a lot of high school English teachers.
More than one former student. Yeah, so, yeah. That shout out goes both ways. Jimmy and I were talking earlier about how what I said about him was he was so talented that all I could do was just sort of pat him on the back and say, "Hey, do it. Just do it." But he shared with me that he's teaching a course now, and excuse me, he's using some of the stories that I used in his creative writing class, maybe 20-something years ago now. We won't say exactly how long ago. But as far as influences, I had the most interesting opportunity just a couple of days ago, and that was to sit down with somebody for a podcast interview where I was asked to pull 6 really influential books. Well, I had, a stack of 12, and I made myself stop. But it was really interesting for me to think back, and obviously, for my place in time, it's Welty, it's Faulkner, it's Barry Hannah. Somebody who hasn't been mentioned is Walker Percy, who was just a fabulous, fabulous writer. But there are a couple of people who come to mind who never really got the recognition that I think they should have gotten. One was Lewis Norden, who was primarily a short story writer. And I started out writing short stories. I wrote short stories for a long time and didn't think I could write a novel. And when the novel bug finally bit, I was wringing my hands saying, I can't do this. And my husband said, well, just remember that a novel is just a long story. And you have a lot more room to play and develop. And so eventually, I made that step. But Buddy Norden was just such a marvelous craftsperson. He writes the kind, and they're very, shall I use the term down home stories. There are stories about misfits, outcasts, people who are down on their luck, teenage boys who don't know from straight up what's going on. But they are the most poignant, laughable, crying, crocodile tears stories that I think I have ever read. So there's Buddy. There is Flannery O'Connor, of course, is not a Mississippian, but is somebody who's better known. But her stories are also quirky, and they play to the outsider. And her faith is I thought about her when you were talking, Jamie. Her faith was such an important part of her life. And yet she saw her faith and the Christian life in ways that most of us would never begin to imagine. That's enough. I could go on forever about the influences. Those are just a few.
Well, I know we're pushing up against our deadline, so I'm, our timeline here, but I have a short question that I'm actually stealing from the Stacks podcast by Tracy. I'm blanking on her last name, but she's here at the book festival. Do you have a favorite writing snack? Or beverage?
Coffee?
Classic.
A lot of coffee.
Popcorn.
Chocolate. Okay.
I'm so chaotic. I can't pick one.
It doesn't have to be your favorite. It can be a favorite,
Let's say cake.
Cake.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was about to say
I need to level up.
Gotta say bourbon. Someone needs to say bourbon. That's a great writing snack.
Cake is not often, I have to say. No, that's a treat. You finish something.
You worked through those revisions.
It's more like a reward snack.
Yeah, I get that. Well, I just thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to our wonderful panelists who will be signing books outside at the tent. So if you want to get your book signed, I think that's going to be the best place rather than coming up here, and you'll have time to chat with them and get them to sign books. You can buy your book first and then come bring it to get it signed. So let's just give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.